Good morning, everyone. Welcome again to our Iscia seminar series, The Power of Humour. This is the ninth seminar in our series, and for those of you who might have joined us for the first time, the seminar basically runs for the rest of the year, roughly weekly at about this time. So we're going to end the first part of the seminar for our winter break and then pick up at the end of July for the second part of the seminar. So for now, please remember to keep your videos off, stay muted as our speaker presents. And just quickly, as the overall title of our seminar suggests, our thematic is quite open. But one of the threads that we're pulling through is the question of how humor might or might not contribute to peace building. And one of the questions is whether there are kinds of humor that kind of foster communality and whether there are kinds that produce kind of conflict rather. So in relation to that question, I'm very happy to introduce Ibukun Filani to you, whose academic home, so to speak, is the English department at Augustine University, llara-Epe. And although he is currently a research fellow of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation at Technological University of Chemnitz, Germany, he's published widely on humor, and in his latest work, he's rethinking this notion of cooperativeness and communality in comedy venues in view of our, I think, quite strong tendency to hold on to private and egocentric assumptions. So this actually speaks to concerns raised by Iscia about the relation between humor and offense in cross-cultural contexts. But we can pick up this discussion after the presentation. Just to let you know that if thoughts strike you as the presentation progresses, please note them down in the chat or just indicate that you would like to speak to them, and I'll invite you to speak to them at the end of the presentation. So to continue and extend our conversation about the power of humor, let me welcome Ibukun Filani, and I will now hand over to you, Ibukun. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much Andre, for the wonderful introduction. Thank you for having me today to give my talk on humor. Without much ado, I think I should begin by sharing my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, all right. My title today is Rethinking Cooperativeness and Commonality in Comedy Venues. And what led to this for me is the recent events we are having around comedy performances across the world. And I'm thinking about how my own discipline, linguistics, can help us to understand how we can conceptualize what happens when a comedian makes a joke and then the comedian needs to keep positive face in the society and then has to apologize for the joke. So I want to play around some concepts within linguistic pragmatics. Linguistic pragmatics is the discipline that deals with interaction, how we generate and convey meaning, and how we interpret meaning. One of the assumptions I'm taking is that joke performance, which is primarily done through speech, through utterances, is also the performance of utterances and is also the performance of meanings. So what happens in a comedy venue is that a comedian stands upon the stage and gives some meanings and people make fun of those meanings. So I want to see how some principles within linguistic pragmatics can help us understand what happens in comedy venues. So I'll move on to my next slide. And here I want to briefly mention some of the key concepts that are cardinal to what I'm dealing with. I perfectly understand that this is a multidisciplinary context, so I am not trying to give too technical definitions of this concept. I'm just going to give them in the common sense notions which we have them. The first one is the idea of cooperation, joint task, and co-construction. And it simply means that two people come together to get something done together. So Mr. A and Mr. B are involved in a conversation, and the two of them must contribute to make the conversation go ahead, or else the conversation will break down. Then the second one, commonality. Generally, cultural studies assume that stand-up comedy performance takes place in the context of commonality. In other words, there is no individual identity. Every kind of individual identity is, every kind of the individual identity disappears in the context of joke performance. For instance, everybody is expected to laugh at the same time in the audience. Everybody is expected to clap at the same time in the audience. So individuals cannot suddenly decide to say that, okay, this is the point I want to laugh. And then another thing is that if an individual tries to make a reaction that is not needed in the context of the commonality, the individual might be picked upon by the comedian and dealt with in form of some denigrating jokes. Number three is the notion of common ground, and which we have in my discipline in different terminologies: shared assumption, mutual contextual beliefs, presupposition, and so other terms. And what it's simply saying is that for every individual, for every joint task we have, the people involved, the participants involved, have certain beliefs that are common to them. They have some kind of assumption that they take for granted, and this assumption, they bring it into the conversation, and then they also relate to these assumptions while they talk, while they keep the conversation going. In other words, as I'm speaking today, a typical common ground we have together is that I'm going to give a talk on the title I have given, and that while I'm giving the talk, nobody is going to talk, nobody is going to interfere, and after my talk, there will be reaction. That is a common ground. Another common ground we have is that we're going to speak in English. So I cannot suddenly change my language to my native language, which is Yoruba, or try to speak Nigerian Pidgin, which I'm trying to learn, or so I'm not supposed to add some other languages to what I'm saying without giving interpretation. So that is an example of common ground. That's an example of the concept of common ground I'm talking about. The next one is the notion of egocentrism and privatization. I must warn that the idea of egocentrism is not negative, all right? We shouldn't take it as a negative phenomenon. Rather, it simply means that as rational human beings, we interpret stimulus, we interpret communicative stimulus. One of the first things we do is that when we encounter an utterance, when we encounter, for instance, a signboard, what we normally do is not to think about what the person who wrote the signboard says, but we are going to think about how that signboard relates with us individually. And that is why sometimes when we walk in the street, we see certain things and those things do not make meaning to us. It's not that we cannot understand them, but at the point when we take them in, all right, we try to relate it with what we want and not what the person who put it there is trying to convey to us. And one of the assumptions we make in my discipline, linguistic pragmatics, is that egocentrism is a rational cognitive act that everybody carry out when they are interacting with people. Another point here is the idea of privatization. And these two are linked together, and that is why I put them together here. And privatization simply means that what we take as common, what we take as corporation, we view them in the sense of our egocentric perception. In other words, we have already had some kind of common ground today. And one of the things I could do is not to think about the common ground assumption existing in terms of it being common to us, but rather in terms of the way I want to perceive it. So, and that will determine how I will interpret what is common to me and you listening to me. And then the last time that I would like to briefly touch on is the concept of salience. Salience simply means what is very foregrounded to us, what we count, what appears very logical to us, what is very conspicuous to us. So for instance, I'm wearing a t-shirt that is red and blue. all right, for some of you looking at me, you might not be able to pick the picture of the color of the red in my t-shirt. You might pick the blue. And that is because the salience for you picks the blue and not the red. All right. And what is very important about salience is that salience could be arrived at based on conventionality. And when we talk about conventionality, I'm talking about common ground. What we have had in the past can make certain things salient to us. So for instance, if I'm a driver, if I drive very well and I know all the road signs, when I look at a road sign on the street, I can simply interpret it easily because it is salient to me given my own experiences. All right, again, it can also be based on individual experiences, all right? For instance, someone who has always associated red color, all right, with danger, all right, and not see anything beautiful in red, might not, again, be able to interpret the color red in a positive direction, all right? So salience can be based on common ground, it can be based on egocentrism or private interpretation of utterances. Now, let me go to my talk. The background to what I'm giving today are the things that have been happening over time. Jokes, comedians will always make use of swear words, and these swear words are sexist, they could be racist, and then in so many instances, we could say that those words are unacceptable. And there are so many examples of African comedians, American comedians, falling victim of these, and then after making jokes, either in the social media or in the performance space, in the live context, they have to apologize for their jokes, or sometimes too, comedians while on stage still apologize for their jokes. So why is all of these things so? Why do we have all of these things? The point here again is that when do we say a particular joke is offensive? And then when do we say it's acceptable? Or when do we say a joke has gone too far? Well, I'm afraid I want to be like a comedian again now. I have to say to you that I cannot answer all of these questions. So, my talk I won't pretend I'm going to answer all of these questions because really they are beyond me, but I think that we can better understand what is happening if we look at what linguistics has to offer us. And then I go to the idea of humor in stand-up comedy context, which is the area which I am thinking about. Generally, we assume that before joking can take place in a stand-up context, the comedian must make sure that the audience has become homogeneous. In other words, there are many people in the audience, and these people have different experiences, they have different notions, different ideologies, but the audience, the comedian must begin by trying to work out the room, making them one entity, talk to them and make sure that they have agreed, they have a common point. When that has happened, the comedian has created a local context for acceptability and recognizability of jokes, all right? And this particular context will now be used to relate with the common ground assumptions taking place. For instance, the common ground assumptions could be in terms of culture, it could be in terms of language, it could be in terms of target, it could be in terms of so many things, all right? And then when the comedian is making the jokes, he keeps relating to this common ground and taking the audience from the comedy venue to this particular common ground that he has created, given that they have become homogeneous. Now, when that happens, we will now describe the joking act in the stand-up comedy context as a joint act. In other words, we will assume that it is not only the comedian that is saying the joke, everybody there is also saying the joke. It takes two for humor to take place. So as the comedian says the joke, the audience is expected to react to the jokes. So in other words, we will now describe humor in stand-up context as performance, audience, co-production acts, all right? And which will only occur when the audience become one, all right? And what now leads to humor again is the idea that certain things the comedian will say will suddenly become public, suddenly become public, something that individuals in the audience might have been thinking about themselves, all right, but will not, voice out to the community, all right. And if the comedian says it, when they realize that everybody agrees with what the comedian says, I mean, it has attained a collective status, and we call that joy of manifestness. So I move on to my next slide. What is my problem here? Now, the very first problem I think about is that, one, there is no place for individual or private beliefs and experiences. And we see this playing out all the time when a comedian jokes. There have been comedy videos I've seen that some audience members will not just laugh, they will frown at the joke, right? And now, if there is no place for individual or private beliefs and experiences, then we cannot make room for egocentric interpretation of jokes. In other words, we will want to enforce the idea that everybody in the comedy venue must, interpret the jokes the way the comedian wants the jokes to be interpreted. And the problem with this again is that the comedian himself or herself, also privatize common beliefs, all right? And he has to do that because of salience. If he doesn't do that, if he or she doesn't do that because of salience, what will become for grounded, what will lead to humor, will be based on common ground, will be based on common ground, and it wouldn't give us the kind of surprise that will lead to laughter. I'm still going to show some kind of chart to make that clear as we go on. Now, the point again here is that we know that individuals in comedy venues will always deploy communal identity. They want to speak to laugh together, clap together, get entertained together. So they relate to the common ground they have. And in doing that, they might have to suspend their private interpretation of whatever the comedian says. All right. And in reality, one of the things I've learned in my discipline is that jokes are not interpreted differently from every other form of utterances. We, as humans, we do not deploy different cognitive mechanisms to understand how we should drive on the road, and then to understand how we should talk to our wife. It's the same cognitive mechanism we deploy. So, and if that is the case, then I think that we can also deploy some common knowledge, some common theory rather, which we have developed in understanding how human operates when communicating. And then the point here is that human beings are rational beings, and if they're rational, they will always deploy the same set of approaches to their new experiences. And one of the things that I've seen is that one of the things I'm trying to argue for is that when audiences in the comedy venue encounter jokes, the very first thing they do is to privatize the joke. And then if they are satisfied at that level, they go on. And if they are not satisfied, they have to relate with what exactly the comedian is trying to do. So I move on to my next slide. Now I'm trying to give a broader description of these. This circle here in my first schema here, all right, utterances having a common sense. What I'm driving at here is that for everything that is said, all right, there is a common ground property in what is being said. And this common ground property can be divided into two extremes, all right? One has to do with linguistic property and semantic meaning. The other has to do with cultural experiences. So when we have an utterance, the utterance is made up of semantic properties, the meaning of the words, the way the words collocate together in sentence, the way it's used in interaction. And these are just pure logical sense of the use of the words. The other side is the cultural angle. A typical example here might be the word marriage, which can be interpreted differently, or the word family, which can be interpreted differently, given cultural alliances, as it were. So, and the word-specific semantic properties and then the culture-specific conceptual properties makes the common ground of the utterance that is being used. All right. Now, the common ground itself feeds the mutual background knowledge that the audience and the comedian has about what is ongoing. And then what happens typically in a comedic venue is that the comedian takes the mutual background knowledge, which is got from the common scene, all right, and privatize it and individualize it in the jokes, all right, used in a way that is not in the common ground sense, such that the audience are able to find some kind of surprise, some kind of incongruity, so that they can encounter something that will make them to laugh. I move on to my next slide. So what is the implication of this for comedy performance? All right. The very first thing I'm trying to put out is that a typical stand-up comedy performance is not just a performance of, it is just not an activity that leads to laughter. It is a negotiation of meaning. And if it's a negotiation of meaning, and then there are different individuals in the context where the meaning is taking place, where meaning is being negotiated, people are likely to pick different meanings, you know. And that leads us to something. We need to question the institutional identities of the participant in the comedy venue. To what extent? By institutional identities, I mean the roles of the people in the comedy venue, be it the comedian and the audience. Typically, because stand-up comedy is a unique form of conversation, it makes it that interactional power lies with the comedian. The comedian has the role to say what should be said to make the people to laugh, whereas the audience have only restricted role, only to laugh and to react to whatever the comedian says. All right, so the institutional identities limit the negotiation of meaning. All right, in other words, only the comedian is really allowed to negotiate meanings. The audience are not supposed to. All right, so given the common ground, all right, the comedian can decide to use the collective sense of words, marriage, gender, politics, the case, whatever it might be, might use the collective sense, which might be what they have experienced culturally together, or what they have in their language, in their cognition in their language, right? Or he might decide to use what he thinks is most appropriate, all right, for the performance of the joke. Now, if that is the case, there will be an impact on how we will conceive cooperation in comedy venue. Remember that cooperation in this sense is that two people coming together to share a joke, allowing one to say the joke where the other reacts to the joke. All right. So cooperation in this sense will have to be that audience members need to suspend their own background belief, need to suspend their own individual experiences and use whatever the comedians give as individual experience. And that is what I try to provide in this schema, all right? Background beliefs, giving us language, events, person, whatever is being said by the comedians, all right? What the comedian does is that he or she privatizes that, all right? And then it gives us jokes in the comedy venue. Now, the point now here is that if the audience too try to do the same thing the comedian has done, in other words, if the audience try to privatize the comedic representation of the background beliefs, there is likelihood that the jokes performed will be taken too far. And we must also remember that the audience privatizing comedic representation is not that the act of egocentrism that they have displayed is far from the common ground, but from the background belief. No, what happens there is that they simply relate what the comedian says with their own background, with the shared background beliefs. But rather than taking the cue of the comedian, they decided to use their own private interpretation. In other words, what led to salience for them is not the common ground. It's not what is conventional. It's not what everybody knows, but what they think is most appropriate in their own context. And then when we have this, we simply have situations where jokes have been taken too far. And then there is going to be a lot of challenge, a lot of misinterpretation. And the reverse will take place if we have a comedian no, rather if we have the audience accepting the comedic representation as it is, unprivatizing them. In other words, taking what the comedian says and relating it with the background beliefs in the way that the comedian has used it. And then if that happens, then what will lead to salience for the audience will not be the shared common ground which the audience have used, but the way the comedian has interpreted it, the way the comedian has deployed it for them. So that is what will end up giving some kind of shared common ground. I think I can stop sharing now. Okay, thank you. Do I still have time?
Filani, you have, Ibukun, you have a little bit of time. You can, well, you're actually exactly on time. I mean, we could go over to questions at the moment.
Thank you for listening. Yes. Yeah, I think I should just stop here. Thank you for listening. I appreciate comments.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. Would you mind stop? Yeah. There we go. Great. Then we can communicate and wow, yes, thank you. that has already inspired a whole lot of questions in me, but I'm not going to abuse my position this time. And I would first of all like to invite members of our audience to ask questions. The first person that I would like to invite up to kind of question or comment is Akin Taylor. Apologies for any horrible expressions or pronunciations of your name. But yeah, if you would like to put your video on perhaps and chat to Ibukun.
Okay, fine. Okay, fine. Yeah, thank you very much. Can you hear me, please?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity. It's always nice listening to Dr. Ibukun Filani, and the idea is that he has to push forward. For me, what I seem to hear from the discussion, from his presentation so far, is that he's looking for the role of the individual in such a social context as what we have when there is stand-up comedy performance, and that's quite good. But my comment really revolves around the fact that he should also Prof or Doctor should also try to look at the fact that the media, in a way, also conditions the extent to which the individual can assert his voice or privatize what it means, what he says when he talks about the privatization of the collective, the privatization of common ground. That the media also, I think the media also plays a role. I'll just try to call attention to two things. If it were to be a joke on a social media platform, say Twitter or say Facebook, the kind of reaction it generates and the sustainability of that reaction is different from what you have in the context of a live performance. So that the media can also condition it. And then because there's this inherent fluidity and the simultaneity of what you call a stand-up comedian context, a live performance is different. So even if you throw the performer and do all that, he holds the mic, his role is different from yours, and there is unequal power distribution. So it's going to succeed privatizing common knowledge or common ground than the audience trying to react, except they go violent. Except that. But in the social media context, it's easier for us, the listeners or the audience, to gain a hand above the comedian, whoever might have done the comedic post. So I think that if one moves from one context to the other context, we also condition it. Then the other question I wish to ask, and then that takes me to another matter, is the individual really individual in the real sense of it? Is individual always individual? Don't you get to a point where the individual becomes enmeshed in the social. So that, for example, if it were to be the social media platform and your own ideology does not sit well with the kind of joke that is being projected or that is being put forward by the comedian, you react to it. And then you react to it in an adversarial manner, right? And when you react in an adversarial manner, then you may be able to generate a followership in that instance, so that your own reaction now generates a followership, and that becomes social again. So it becomes a platform for forming an alternative social, micro-social movement against that joke. In the context of a live performance, it's just that it's difficult. The same thing is formed, but the life of it, the life of that alternative micro-social movement in a live performance is it's very, how do I put it now? It doesn't last. It's very ephemeral. It goes away in minutes because of the role that that comedian takes in that context, which shows for us a kind of an unequal power distribution again. So when we say something is egocentric, how egocentric is it? Because anything egocentric derives mostly from the social. That's the part I don't seem to get well. Then when we say egocentric interpretation of joke, is it not that the individual is it really entirely egocentric? Because all of us derive a meaning from the instantiation of that common ground by the comedian. But based on our individual, certain individual, not necessarily dispositions, ideologies, beliefs, we may derive different interpretations. But different interpretations are still coming from that social thing. And then when I get my own personal interpretation, I can dissipate, I can give it out. And when I give it out, others may follow. So that the individual is never too preponderant, is never always there, is always sometimes meshed into the social in the long run. That's just my comments. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Pella. There's so many things you have raised, and I doubt that I can react all of them at this time. But you have given me insight into so many things that I should consider in my writing. But I would like to say that we should think about the idea of negotiation. That the comedian too, beyond telling jokes, is also negotiating some macro social structures, you know, and then that's one. The comedian is trying to negotiate some macro social structures. I have two examples in my mind now. One is basket mouth rape joke of 2014, all right, which was initially very well celebrated until a Kenya blogger talked about it being sexist as a rape joke. And basket mouth had to apologize, all right? And if I go back, and as a linguist, when I look at, each time I look at that joke, I do not see rape about it at all. Although again, as a linguist, when I think about the joke again, I think that placing rape as the punchline also makes it a rape joke. And that goes back to what I'm talking about. When we hear the word joke, what will make the joke successful is if everybody that encountered the joke tries to think in the pattern the joke writer or the joke performer has given the joke. Aside that, we are going to have lots and lots of different meanings being negotiated. And the example that I have in mind is this late American stand-up comedian, George Carlin. He made an stand-up special on climate change. And each time I watch that particular video, and I think about that same video in a context today of climate change, all right, he would be termed as someone who denies science, all right? It will be termed as too conservative. He's going to be a far-right individual given that particular performance today. And George Carlin, given his ideology, is a far-left. All right, so these are issues. So if I'm going to interpret that text, I have to interpret it vis-a-vis what he said, how he has presented it, and not vis-a-vis what I think about climate change today. So that is what I'm trying to look at, the place of how individuals can bring their own negotiate what they think about a joke into what is being performed. And that leads me to the idea of salience. Utterances will always give us different interpretations. We can't have just one. But the question is, how do we arrive at the right one? Again, we must question the idea of the right one, because there is nothing that is right in itself, as it were. We have to negotiate what is right, you know. What is right to me is not right to you. So I think that, like I said, I can't answer all of the question. So this is where I'm going to stop in my reaction to your comments. Thank you.
Thanks so much. There was so much in both the questions and comments and your response. So luckily we do record the session. I will put it on YouTube so we can go back to these sessions again and again to kind of absorb more of what you have said. Could I, there are two people who would like to ask questions to you. Could I ask Jason to come up, and then I'll ask Felix? Thanks, Jason.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the position. So I'm going to be, the first thing I was going to say is it might be that a few more examples to illustrate your discussion come up, because when I was listening, I can definitely picture, I can see the dynamic you're talking about in play. But one of the things, at the risk of being an annoying philosopher, is I was wondering what your specific thesis is here, because it was very interesting that what you were saying is that we might read the kind of what happens around this pushback, not just in moral terms. That was one of those questions that you wanted to highlight. And what I think an interesting thesis coming out of what you're saying would be that what's interesting about this is that there's a kind of an epistemic failure when we fail to recognize the disjunction between the crowd-constructed context of reception and the individual one when it gets re-examined later. And that's really interesting because it seems obvious to me that there's a moralistic aspect to these things, and it's moral, and there's something interesting to be said about this. But I wanted to push back, and I suppose here more examples, like you mentioned the rape joke, and I'm not familiar with that particular example, because there's something potentially really interesting about what you're saying, is that what we could be doing with this is we could get a more accurate, a more useful tool that could come out of this, would come from analyzing the distinction between the private interpretation and the communally constructed one. But for it to be more useful, it has to not just tell us that sometimes there's a breakdown, it has to tell us which instances of censure are legitimate, like even in the context of the crowd's reception, this constitutes going too far, as opposed to those which are illegitimate, because it seems like we can come up with examples of those, because it doesn't seem like we want to say that all instances of censure of comedians come from a misinterpretation of context. And I don't think you were saying that. You want to allow that. So what interests me is how we say something useful about which instances are the result of this breakdown in context of interpretation, or if what you're saying is that all comedy is always playing with that boundary, and that there might be broader contexts which break it down. So I'm really interested in that, but I was just wondering if you can clarify what your thesis is about where you want to push with this. And sorry,
yeah, you can hear me now. Yeah. Well, thank you for bringing that up, but I really did not think about that while I was composing my presentation. Honestly, I have to say that. But I think now that what I'm pointing to is that, one, we must take jokes as jokes, or else we keep interpreting them. See, during Dr. Uzu's presentation, I made a comment and I said that a punch is not an easy thing. So whether it's punch up, punch down, or punch, is it vertically or horizontally now, the person who receives the punch will not like it at all. So So for me, it is more of trying to understand what takes place when a joke breaks down. And then if it breaks down, we might not necessarily have to say that a joke teller, although this is also a faulty assumption, the joke teller is pushing some kind of negative or terrible position on us. Because for instance, now the rape joke example I have given, all the, I think you should be aware of the Is it Joshua Charlie cartoons in France, and then the Mohammed joke in Belgium, or is in Netherlands now, right? And over again, it's funny that we can't, I always try to do this when I encounter texts like jokes, when I'm trying to tease out some kind of analysis from them. Can we really deal with the jokes without bringing in some kind of macro social structures into the jokes? Now, once we have been able to do that, once we have been able to do that, then there wouldn't be any challenge. The jokes will flow easily. But the point now is that as individuals, we have been made to always think about the macro social context where we come from, just like Akintel has just said today. So if I encounter a joke and I'm thinking about what the comedian is trying to say, I'm not going to start with what the comedian is trying to say. I'm going to think about, why is this comedian saying this thing this way? And in other words, I have gone beyond the idea that it is a joke to start thinking about something more serious than a joke. And we are all humor scholars, and I think it's a conversation we will always have. How do we separate all of these things and then make for a better society? How do we let jokes be jokes, and then it will kind of oil our society, and then remove all of the frictions we are having that jokes have already generated. And what's kind of come to my mind right now is the position of these, is it the British scholar on ethnic humor around the world? I've forgotten his name. It's not Oring Elliott, no. Jokes and their relation. No, that's fraud. I'm trying to remember his name. A British scholar on jokes and ethnic humor around the world. Ethnic jokes around the world is one of his monographs, and one of the things he has said over and over again is that ethnic jokes are not negative. They are not in any way negative. And when I read someone like Sharon Lockyer and the likes, they are always saying that Belink, is it Belink? When I read them, they're always saying that our ethnic jokes are always based on negative stereotyping, and because they are negative stereotyping, we cannot say they are not negative. But the British scholar I'm mentioning was trying to say that for every ethnic joke we always find, for instance, if I see in Nigeria, for instance, if I see a joke against the Yoruba, I'm going to find a similar joke like that against the Igbo, against the Igala, against the Hausa. So, I don't know. I think it all depends on the stance you want to take about interpretation of jokes and the negotiation of meaning that comes with performance of joke. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay. Sorry, I just want to, I'll shut up in a sec, but I just want to push back.
Thank you.
Why I'm interested in what you're saying, Ibukun, is that there are two things you can do with this, because the one is the kind of thing that I'm suggesting you might want to push on this is useful because there are such things as actually harmful utterances which get excused as jokes. And it makes sense that we want to be able to distinguish between actually harmful utterances that simply get excused because one can appeal to the idea of a misunderstanding in context. So there's a real value in the idea that we can use this mechanism you're describing to situate what that distinction is. But the other is, when I think of some of the most, the virtuoso stand-up comedians, or at least those that spring to my mind, they're people who do this thing you're describing and play it as an additional instrument. They build a narrative over the course of a show or a set in which they establish a shared context with an audience. They play with the idea of the audience's political expectations, and they point out to the world and draw on the tension between those. And I think of sort of Hannah Gadsby or Stuart Lee are very, very, I'm coming from my very Western cultural context, but they're people who build shows based on exploiting the tension between how things will be received beyond the current show and the kind of exactly what you described, this constructed thing. So what I think is interesting is that the best stand-up comedians seem to be aware of this tension you describe and play with it. So there's something very valuable there. So that's why I'm very interested in this line that you're taking. So that's not an ongoing thing. Thanks very much for your observations.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, Jason. I actually share some of those interests. Maybe we can chat about them in a bit, but I'd like Felix maybe to come up and let us know what you'd like to say.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me, please?
Yes.
We can hear you well.
Okay.
Are we allowed to see you?
Okay. Thank you very much, Ibukun, for your presentation. It's a fascinating topic. And but just a few questions. And just in line with what has already been said. If jokes or humor are co-constructed, if the identity that you mentioned, communal identity and private identities are also to be excluded, and we are talking about the joke venue, I'm really concerned. Why does the comedian apologize for the jokes that are co-constructed by himself and the audience? Okay, that's just something we can think about. I guess this is probably because the comedian feels that the face wants of or face needs of the audience may have been violated in one form or the other. But since we are talking about what happens at the comedy venue, I'm really wondering, doesn't the context of the venue of the comedy presuppose that these things are, whatever is said in this particular context should be taken as a joke? What role does this context play? Because we're talking about the venue of the comedy. And then I'm also worried, how do we really measure offense in this particular context? And how do we measure the offense? And what is the effect of this on the humor, which is, of course, the reason for people to gather together at a particular venue and to have some form of jokes and laughter. I think these are a few things I would like to just say, a few clearance here. Thank you.
Prof, thank you very much. I don't know, like I said during my presentation, I'm afraid I can't answer all the questions. And this will demand me thinking and thinking again. The primary thing I will say, the immediate thing I'm going to say is that we must remember that joking involves negotiation of meanings, and that's the point. And if it's a negotiation of meanings, the stand-up comedians understand what can happen to him or her in the context of cancel culture. So if that is that, beyond telling jokes, beyond winning the immediate audience approval, he wants to win the approval of everybody in the world, because he knows that if he fails to win the approval of everybody in the world, even those who will not hear the joke to make informed judgment about the joke, but to read whatever commentary anywhere in the world, all right, he or she is aware that all of them will react to the joke. So he wants to win approval of everybody. So he goes all out. Okay, I'm sorry for my joke, and it has nothing to do with what we have talked about. And I'm sorry if I hurt anybody feeling. I'm sorry. And however, again, that is just what one comedian can do. Another comedian might decide not even to apologize. And we have seen this over and over and over again. I don't know why I'm poor with names. A female American comedian has been challenged for racist jokes, And at the same time, she just felt like, well, if it had been, he mentioned another person's name, a male comedian who performed the joke, he wouldn't have said anything about that. And the male comedian he mentioned is this male comedian that made a joke about homophobic jokes lately. And then there was the issue of Netflix bringing down his shows on Netflix. And then he said he was not going to apologize for the jokes. Oh God, how did I forget the names of these guys? I never thought of them, so I didn't pin them down to talk about them, all right. So that maybe that was why. So he didn't really apologize, all right. I mean, so really, the comedians also beyond saving face in the immediate context, also think about the wider implications. If I say this joke and if I don't apologize, will I still win some other rights? That's my reaction.
Mm. Thank you.
David Chappelle, yeah, Dave Chappelle. Dave Chappelle was one.
Oh, Dave, yes. I was just thinking it was that, yeah.
Thank you for that. I think Akintala is raising his hands again. Can we still take that?
Sorry, what was that?
I think that Akintala is raising his hand. Can we still take that?
Yes.
Okay.
I'd like to invite him up to respond.
Yeah,
I think you're muted for them.
Okay, fine. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I just wanted to say just two things on two issues. I think Professor Ogwana's comment brought back something to me, because the question is very important to what we're doing. I think you also asked the question earlier on, if indeed there's a constructed common ground between the person saying the joke and the audience, why don't they take offense? I think in answering that question, one may tinker with the idea of the fact that the common ground that that we all use, when we say there's a common ground, there's a common ground, can we also work with the fact that we imagine that a common ground? It's just imagined, and it's close to the formation of hypotheses. Sometimes common ground is not as it's not something you can assert before you go into a discourse. We just imagine that this person shares that common ground. So it's rather, now, even when it is just interpersonal, sometimes you imagine somebody shares the common ground, not that you're so sure the person shares the common ground in all instances. Now, for a large audience, like you have at the site of a comedy performance, it's because of the size, you only imagine that all members of the audience share this context. They may necessarily not share that context, and even when they share the context, right, they share the common ground, they may not share the co-construction. How do I say it now? They may not share what to co-construct as humor. Their reaction to that. So it's like we need to walk back a bit and recognize the fact that some of these things are both what is called common ground and what is co-constructed as humor are first of all imagined by the joker, by the person telling the joke, so that becomes the process of privatization, of trying to privatize the common ground. He assumes on his own that he imagines that we share this, but our reactions may show that we don't share it. And that's where possibly aspects of contextualization comes in. I don't know how that works. And that's how it works even in everyday discourse. You know, you contextualize, somebody decontextualizes, then there's need for recontextualization. He puts up a joke, he sees that we don't share that context, he tries to decontextualize it by saying that was not what he meant in the first place, and then he tries to create another context. So I think contextualization and associated things like recontextualization and decontextualization can help to also talk about that process of privatization. Then the other thing that Dr. Filani said earlier about why can't we take joke as joke, I think I really love the way Dr. Jason put it the other time. It is because it's dangerous for some people's collective living to take jokes as jokes. Because the idea seems to be that, maybe we should start from the idea of macro structures. I believe that certain things make up what we call the macro structures, and that those things dictate both the process of discourse production and discourse comprehension at the same time. so that discourse itself does not occur on its own, but we bring all those cognitive aspects, all those macrostructures into interpretation of discourse and into its production. Now, if that is true, once you say a joke, it enters into part of our collective consciousness, or what we might call some kind of narratives, meta-narratives. If you say a rape joke and you keep saying it over and over, then it then becomes like you are pushing it that we put it as part of our meta-narratives, and that becomes part of our macro structures. And then we imagine that rape becomes something that's generally acceptable. Some people don't want us to get to that point. So all people usually take a stance against things like rape joke, ethnic jokes, because foundationally they see more than joke. They believe that beyond the joke, this thing can enter into our collective consciousness, and that's where we become another we. We start forming new cultures that may not be what we have always been. So it's because people recognize the power of narratives, and it controls people's lives. That's why jokes have boundaries sometimes. That's what I think. So taking joke as joke, I don't think many people will be comfortable with it.
Thanks. Quick response, Ibukun. I've got my kind of eye on time.
Okay. Well, so many things to say, but I will simply say that, like I've said, nobody likes to be the target. That's just the point. The only way this thing will work is if we can have jokes without targets. If we can have jokes without targets, then it will be fine. And there wouldn't be questions of whether someone is doing something that is not acceptable across board or not, but jokes always come with targets. I mean, as much as we know, especially when it comes into performance context, there is someone that is targeted. And once there is someone that is targeted, there is a problem, because the person that is targeted to is negatively constructed. And if the person remains the target over and over again, like Dr. Akitela said, it becomes part of the meta-narrative and it has to start pushing back and all of that. So I don't know how we deal with that. I think it's not a linguistic question, so to say, maybe a philosophy question for Professor Andre and Professor Jason.
That's passing the buck. But I do have my eye on time now. We are almost up from the session, and I do want to say thank you very, very much to everybody for an incredibly rich, that was, as you say, too much to wrap your mind around in this conversation. But as I said, luckily we have a recording and you can go back to it. The thing that I would like to end with is actually just in a way to follow on from your last comment, and in a way up the stakes of this conversation, because I really do think that some of the dynamics that you've spoken about here and offered here could actually form a kind of a critique of the notion of peace building as creating commonality or community and all of that. I mean, in a way, perhaps the idea of peace building, given all of your conversation here, could be rethought as making the space for kind of, I don't know, responsible or generous or respectful negotiation of conflict. Maybe that's what peace building is. So I think that your thoughts have an incredibly broad application. I think that's what Jason was also referring to, and that there's so much exciting stuff that's come out of just this little conversation, lots to think about. So yes, I want to thank you very, very much for joining us, and I do hope that we will all return to this video time and again, and as you say, take the time to think some of these concepts through quite seriously and quite deeply. I think there's lots to be done here. So thank you very much. It was lovely to have you here, and yes, have a great weekend, everybody. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you for listening.
Okay.